Evans and I'm Deputy Director at Policy Exchange, and I'd like to welcome you to our event today on navigating the new politics. The way that we'll be formatting is each of the heads of our unit will speak briefly to outline the key priorities of the coalition, possible tensions within their policy areas, and then outline for you the work that Policy Exchange will be doing to forward our agenda over the coming 12 months. We'll then hear from Neil O'Brien, our Director, who's going to discuss the underlying themes and ideas running through the coalition's agenda. We'll then have a Q&A, but we'll be finishing promptly at 2. Our research team there will be on hand for anyone who'd like to chat to them after the event, so please feel free to talk to them in the reception area behind. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Max from our Crime and Justice Unit.
Thank you. The first thing to say about the crime and justice policy area is that there was a distinct lack of detail and a lack of meat in the coalition's policy programme. So let me try and fill in a few gaps. Some things we know. Nick Herbert has been appointed as Police Reform Minister. He also has an overarching role in the Ministry of Justice in charge of wider criminal justice reform. But more importantly, Nick was the architect of the Tories' police reform plans in opposition. And his appointment underlines the importance that David Cameron attaches to reforming the police. Which brings us to the first key crime and justice reform priority, which is the introduction of locally elected police commissioners. We know the first Home Office bill will contain provisions for their introduction. This is something we at Policy Exchange have advocated for many years. The police remain the only public agency in which public confidence falls the more contact you have with them. So we think that this will has the potential to transform that relationship. The second reform priority is only hinted at in the coalition document. It's described as a full review of the terms and conditions of police officer employment. But its implications are quite potentially profound. There are two main ways to improve the efficiency of the police. One is a sort of centrally driven drive to improve collaboration and the integration of IT systems. The other is to facilitate workforce modernisation, which this review will do. What this means is that because of the budget cuts that are coming, we're going to have to look at the workforce mix between sworn police officers and police staff. So we're likely to see the increasing civilianisation of the police, and that will mean headline reductions in the number of police officers. There'll also be implications for police pensions. We know the Treasury has agreed to honour the current police pay deal until September 2011, but they said nothing about honouring existing police pension arrangements, which are likely to change. And these are amongst some of the most generous in the public sector. In terms of sentencing in prisons, the Conservatives have quite happily dropped very expensive pledges they made in opposition to do things like introduce a presumption of prison for knife carriers and to double the sentencing powers of magistrates. What this has also allowed them to do is not build any new prison places over and above what the previous government had planned. In terms of other flagship Ministry of Justice policy, the other key reform priority is to pay independent providers by the results they achieve in reducing reoffending, with the money coming from the savings generated from lower cost of the criminal justice system, and implementing this will be a key priority. There are inevitably some tension points and areas where disagreements are likely. To start with, it's no secret that the police vigorously opposed the Tories' plans the coalition's plans to introduce elected police commissioners. The President of ACPO has said that chief officers might want to resign, and they're also opposed by a number of other representative bodies and interest groups. So Theresa May will need to use all her powers of persuasion to get chief constables on side. She made a good start with her speech to the Police Federation a couple of weeks ago. However, opposition to the plans hasn't only come from the police. The Lib Dems opposed them during the election campaign, warning that they would lead to the politicisation of the police. They would prefer to elect the entire multi-member police authority rather than having just one single individual. But there are signs of compromise in the coalition policy document. So the Lib Dems appear to have secured a concession that the Commissioner will be subject to a strict series of checks and balances. A policy exchange, we think that it's very important that that doesn't water down a reform which, in its purest form, has the potential to really improve the relationship between the police and the public. So anything that looks or smells like the return to police authority should be rejected. Given that most departments which haven't been ring-fenced, of which the Home Office is one, will be facing huge budget cuts, we believe that the number of police officers will have to fall. The problem is that there's political nervousness around this. The debate at the moment is all being conducted, with the need to maintain headline, frontline police and PCSO numbers. If the cuts come within that existing political framework, it's going to be impossible for forces to implement. So the Conservatives will have to take the Lib Dems and the public with them in changing the terms of that debate. There'll also be tensions when it comes to prisons and sentencing. It's no secret that the Tories and the Lib Dems almost hold diametrically opposing views on punishment and what works to cut crime. So it's possible that the Conservatives might take this opportunity, as they have done in the coalition negotiations, to almost put the arms race to one side of sentencing, and it'll be interesting to see whether that survives the first spate of stabbings in London, for example. Another possible area of tension is what kind of prisons to build in terms of the previous government plans. So we know that 7,500 prison places are coming, but we don't know whether they're going to be huge super jails holding 1,500 prisoners, or whether they're going to be smaller, more local jails. The government are likely to find the economies of scale is such that they have to go ahead with the bigger prisons, and the Lib Dems are likely to have to take issue with that, so that might cause problems too. So how are we going to sort of fit into this debate? We think that the Lib Dem concerns about police politicisation and police commissioners can be overcome. We published a report at the back end of last year called Partners in Crime, and we outlined a system of safeguards which we think could mollify the Lib Dems and sort of deal with their concerns. We said that they shouldn't be able to stand on a party political ticket. They should have no criminal record, and they would have to swear an oath of office to uphold the law. We've also suggested power of recall if they break that oath. And we'll continue to push for those safeguards to be put in the Home Office bill. We'll also soon be publishing research on police officer numbers, showing how workforce modernisation, making sure that the skill set of the police force matches the activities they need to carry out, could save hundreds of millions of pounds and simultaneously improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the police. We're not necessarily talking about reducing the overall headcount, but we are talking about converting police officers into police staff. There was little indication in the coalition policy document about where the acts would fall in the Ministry of Justice. We know they're not going to close prisons. We know they're going to conduct a review of legal aid. But we think there's also significant potential for reforming the court system, making it much more efficient, using video links and virtual courts much more, rationalising the number of magistrates' courts, and selling off the assets. We think there are hundreds of millions of pounds to be saved in the court system, and we'll be publishing work on this later in the year, because the debate around court modernisation hasn't really got going yet, and we want to get the ball rolling. In terms of paying by results, this is a hugely attractive idea, and some see it as the holy grail for the criminal justice system. We're interested in it too. We are currently carrying out a major piece of work on its feasibility. But it's not a panacea, and as we've seen in health and welfare, it takes a long time to implement. So we think the first step should be to work within existing structures and make sure that incentives are aligned across the board at a local level, and that local authorities are fully engaged in reducing reoffending. So we'll be publishing a plan to do just this in the autumn. And I'm going to hand over to our Chief Economist, Andrew.
Thank you. Well, the economy is always a big issue, but on this occasion the coalition agreement identifies the deficit as the most urgent issue facing Britain. A year ago tomorrow, we published our first paper in our public spending series, arguing for an emergency budget to cut spending and expressing our concern that spending cuts weren't really being discussed very much. Within a week, no one could talk about anything else. So we're obviously pleased with that particular development, but we think that the emergency budget in particular, and then subsequently much of other policy, should focus on delivering very considerable spending cuts. However, spending cuts alone won't be enough to assure sustainability of our finances. We also need to deliver economic growth. One part of that would be some changes in the tax structure. Now, we argued in a paper a few months ago that it would, amongst the most damaging taxes would be a tax on employers' national insurance, which mercifully in the coalition agreement, the Conservatives' proposal to reverse some of the rise in employers' national insurance has been sustained. We also have argued that there needs to be, it might be useful to have some more taxation of corporate debt interest, and that it would be preferable perhaps to have rises in income tax rates rather than rises in VAT rates. Another important area will be to create a systemically robust financial system, one in which banks can be allowed to fail instead of being bailed out by the state. We've had enormous amounts of additional financial regulation that's been announced, but much of it has dealt with symptoms of various sorts and with mechanisms by which you might make things a little bit less likely for you to have problems, so you can tolerate larger shocks. But those haven't really dealt very much with fundamentals in our view so far. We had argued structurally that the Bank of England should have supervisory control in respect of micro-prudential supervision as well as macro-prudential supervision. Sadly, that's a measure which the coalition agreement has kicked into the long grass for now, but there are lots of other things which are still coming up, and we still hold to that view. Another important issue for the economy as a priority would be to make sure that those people who have lost jobs during the recession don't turn into long-term unemployed in the way that happened in the 90s and the 80s with high unemployment. So we think that that's another important area to deal with. In terms of tensions in the coalition, one fairly clear possible area of tension is the mix of tax rises and spending cuts. Now, the Conservatives have been wise enough to accept our recommendation that the best ratio was one of 4 units of spending cuts to each one of tax rises, 80% being spending cuts. The Liberal Democrats have favoured a slightly lower ratio, something like 2.5 to 1. So it's possible that that might be an area of tension. Of course, we see some tensions already in respect of which taxes need to rise in order to fund the Liberal Democrat proposal to raise quite considerably the income tax threshold. So we already see some discussions over CP2. There may be other areas where people aren't fully agreed on how to do this. Another potential area of tension might be if there were, as seems likely to be, a double dip in the economy, does that mean that it becomes more urgent to become a little bit more aggressive on the side of spending cuts, or does that mean that you should take a step back and do things a little bit slower? So that's a potential area of tension. Before the election, the Conservatives said that that the recovery and delivering spending cuts were not opposites, they weren't alternatives. You had to get spending down in order to get the recovery. Whilst the Liberal Democrats had tended to argue that the economy was a bit fragile at this stage and now wasn't really the moment. And that was a line which some of them changed after the election, of course, but it's a possible area of tension even so. Another area of possible tension is how these spending cuts might be spread across departments, particularly given ring fencing. Now, many of you might be familiar with this statistic that the NHS ring fence implies that other departments might have to have cuts of around 25% in their budgets. It's an IFS number. However, that's predicated on the Labour Party's previous spending plans, which only involved around 40 billion in spending cuts. We believe that around twice that level, around 80 billion in spending cuts, will actually be required. So it's, even if one thought that 25% was deliverable in terms of cuts in particular departments whilst maintaining the NHS ring fence, whether you could really deal with 50% cuts in other departments, especially if they wouldn't be even, and so you're talking about potentially much larger cuts than that in some departments, remains to be seen. The Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats both took the view that there needed to be some kind of bank levy, and also that there needed to be some sort of restrictions on remuneration in the financial sector. Whether they thought that they meant the same thing by those, once it came down to the details, will be an interesting question. It's possible that one side or another might have thought that they wanted to go further once it comes to the detail. Another area of potential tension is that of the separation of investment and retail banking. The Liberal Democrats were quite committed to that. The Conservatives, though they were sympathetic, weren't very clear. It's been kicked off into the long grass for now. Our view is that that's a mistake, and we're shortly publishing something which gives a rather different approach, which we think cuts across and renders that proposal superfluous, but it remains to be seen whether people will be wise enough to listen to us. Another area is that of trying to incentivize, create incentives for work whilst cutting spending. We believe that there are quite significant reforms required in respect of welfare, but it's always easier to deliver reforms if you've got some money so that you can compensate losers from those. When there's no money available to compensate losers, it can be harder to deliver those sorts of reforms. So among important things that in terms of our forthcoming work, well, we shall continue to defend our 4-to-1 spending cuts to tax rises ratio. You may have been familiar with some of the arguments which we gave. The first in the British political debate to give the argument that you were more likely to promote early recovery by having spending cuts than you were to derail it. And we'll continue to press that argument, especially if there's a double dip. We'll continue also to press the argument that one needs to go further in terms of the spending cuts. We have something like 120 billion in structural deficit. We'd like to see that eliminated, virtually all of it eliminated over at Parliament. Current plans are rather less ambitious. As mentioned before, we think that there's a need to bring some coherence to the reforms of the banking sector. In particular, we think that we want to reintroduce downside risk. So we need some mechanisms that allow bondholders and perhaps under some circumstances even depositors to be exposed to the risk of loss. And in general, we want people to take more responsibility for the financial decisions which they make. And finally, a lot of thinking has been done at the Policy Exchange about how to address some of the issues in structural worklessness. Now, those issues are things which is much easier to address during boom times, because you tend to have to work away a little bit at the edge of them over time to reduce the scope, the numbers of people. They're not something where you can just pass some rule and you eliminate millions of people from benefits all at once. But what we would hope is that attention to that issue isn't lost in the necessary and appropriate attention that will be given to short-term issues on unemployment. So I'm now going to hand over to James, the head of our education unit.
Thank you, Andrew. After the budget deficit, education has perhaps been the most talked about area of policy within the new coalition government to date. So what do we see some of the priorities as in going forward? Well, the flagship of the new politics, one of them undoubtedly is the Academies programme, and the new government has made a commitment to extending Academies and rolling them out, and that's been very evident. The Academies bill has a private place in last week's Queen's speech, and that pledged greater freedom and flexibility for schools, both primary and secondary, in terms of their budgets and curriculum and their staff. Letters have gone to each of these schools across the country, and from Michael Grove, from the Secretary of State, inviting them to apply for Academy status. And those deemed outstanding by Ofsted are already good to go on that front. And this is something which we at Policy Exchange have looked at considerably over the past number of years and have led the way on the idea of getting new providers into the state education system. Most recently in our report, Blocking the Best, which was published earlier this year. And going hand in hand with the Academies programme is the pupil premium. It had pride of place in both Conservative and Lib Dem manifestos. It was in the Queen's speech last week. It might not be rolled out, however, until 2011. Again, this is something which we championed ourselves back in 2008 in our school funding and social justice report. The primary aim, as many of you might know, is to alleviate the risk that school choice reform will increase segregation between well-off and more deprived communities. Yeah, so that's what the pupil premium is about. Moving on then to the skills sector and the further education sector. The 16 to 19 education budget has so far been spared the chop, and that will be welcome news to many further education providers who get about $4 billion every year from the department. In saying that, as recommended in our report Central Learning, published also this year, Train to Gain has already been shown the door. That its budget of 200 million will be redirected in different directions. 150 million of that will go towards creating 50,000 new apprenticeship places. 50 million will go on capital funding. And the likelihood also is that the Skills Funding Agency will go as well. Tuition fees, certainly one of the big issues. Both parties very quiet on the moment, awaiting Lord Brown's review, which is due to report in July. The government has announced that it will wait the findings of that report, but it's made its priorities clear. And these include assessing the impact of student debt, ensuring properly funded university sector, and attracting a higher proportion of students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And again, these are all priorities and elements which we, Policy Exchange, have recently explored and set out in more phase, please. Moving on then to possible tensions. Undoubtedly, the role of local authorities with respect to academies and new schools is a key area. The Conservatives' idea of free schools is predicated on the notion that they should have a sizable degree of autonomy from local authorities. The Lib Dems traditionally in the past have always seen local authorities as having a clear strategic role in schools, both in terms of setting strategy and in terms of intervention. It looks like the Conservatives have so far won the day on this one. The Academies Bill has made that clear. But Liberal Democrat thinking won't have gone away, and if the Academies programme and the New Schools programme run into problems, expect to see the Liberal Democrats calling for local authorities to play a greater role once again. On the pupil premium, broad agreement here in the strategy, but when you look at the detail, things are rather less clear cut. The Lib Dems pledged $2.5 billion for this project in the run-up to the election. They say that money will be coming from outside the school's budget. The early indications are good for cooperation. Sarah Tether of the Liberal Democrats has been given charge over the premium issue, and the Tories seem to be conceding that it will be new money. But the figure of $2.5 billion is noticeable in its absence at the moment, and it's not clear if the new money will come from within the education budget or from completely new from elsewhere. On the area of further education, undoubtedly this is one area where a lot of restructuring is needed, and it is certainly a very complex and bureaucratic area. The new government, from the Conservative point of view, would like to see a further education and funding council separated from higher education. The Liberal Democrats, on the other hand, have called for a council for adult skills and higher education, combining the two. Combining the two might create a good platform for trying to advance higher education in the further education space. On the other hand, bringing the two together could confuse matters and thwart Conservative plans to give greater autonomy to further education colleges. On tuition fees, certainly a big area of possible contention. The Conservatives have been quiet, but there's no doubt that privately they realise that fees will probably need to go up. The Lib Dems, by sharp contrast, have always called for fees to be phased out. The hunch is that the Brown Review is going to ask for fees to be risen in stages over time. And of course, the Lib Dems have a built-in get-out clause in this one. They could abstain if it came to a vote. But there still will be considerable stress within the coalition government on this issue, given that the Lib Dems are particularly wedded to the student vote. So, What is the role of policy exchange in forging the new politics and contributing to the debate? On the area of academies, it's particularly interesting to note that Michael Gove has called for academies to be rolled out in both the primary and the special needs sector. Currently, standalone primary schools across England aren't allowed to apply for academy status, and the Tories have made clear that they want to reverse that. We at Policy Exchange think, however, that we need to appreciate the distinctions between the primary and the secondary sector. I mean, there's no reason why the primary model can't be applied, the academy's model can't be applied to the primary sector. Considerable thought needs to go into those distinctions. Likewise, on the special educational needs side of things, there are clear distinctions in funding. For example, special educational needs schools receiving funding through the statementing process, which requires a lot of cooperation with local authorities. It also requires working with other services within local authorities, such as health. And so applying the bog standard academy model to that might just be so straightforward as we think. And this is something which we at Policy Exchange are looking at closely at the moment. Choice is also an area which we're looking at. School choice is a hotly debated topic, something which is going to be very, very, very relevant as the new government advances their education policy. But we are asking just how practical is this choice, and to what extent has anyone looked at the schools market on the ground. So we'd hope to shed light on what parents are looking for when they choose schools, what sources of information they use and make use of. And the roles played by schools and local authorities in dispensing advice on school choice. On higher education, the role of higher education and further education is something which we are keen to explore. As we all know, tens of thousands of young would-be students were turned away from universities last year, and the situation isn't likely to be any better this autumn. The assumption has always been that one needs to be in university to be working towards a degree. Need this be the case? That's something which we would want to look at into. There has been little study to date into the role of foundation level degrees and as to whether or not these can actually be scaled up. And this is something which is quite important, given that the government wants to reach out to those who are currently not going to university, perhaps those from more deprived backgrounds or older people. So that's something which we hope to explore. And finally, on the issue of tuition fees, we think it's time to bite the bullet and face up to the funding crisis on this issue. The Lib Dems, as I've said, have a built-in get-out clause. The Tories might decide that they're going to dodge the bullet on this one because it's just too tough. But we at Policy Exchange will work hard to ensure that the debate doesn't avoid the reality of the situation. And among other changes that we have called for, those students from wealthiest households to be removed from the public student loan scheme and instead to be offered a loan from a regulated private loan scheme at a lower than commercial rate of interest. So that's something which we will continue to advance in the months ahead. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague in the Energy and Environment team, Robert.
Thank you, James. Environment and energy was one of the areas routinely highlighted as an area where the Conservatives and Liberals are actually quite close together during the coalition talks, an area where they can probably do business. Conveniently for us, it's also an area where we're one of the very few people doing the full range of environment and energy policy, so do watch this space. Well, interestingly, looking at the ministers, the retention of the Tory ministers of state, Greg Barker and Charles Henry, does suggest a degree of continuity, and certainly policy also follows that. Greg Clark's departure as Shadow Secretary of State might have suggested change, but what's interesting is the role he's been given in the Department of Communities and Local Government, driving forward the changes in infrastructure and planning, which is one of his key priorities, which is going to be absolutely crucial for all the sectors that we deal with, energy, water, those sorts of issues, and actually dealing with planning for this sector is quite important. So that's quite an interesting move, that clearly this is being taken seriously. The key priorities of the new government, and the big speech in the coalition agreement, the household deal for energy efficiency. This is one of our one of our reports really advocated this, and we were delighted to see it taken up by pretty much every party in different varieties. This was highlighted as the main priority in the energy bill, and it's obviously something they're really keen to get going with. Reforming energy markets, probably one of the most important things in the coalition deal and in the Queen's speech, but not necessarily clear how they're going to do it. Certainly from Ofgem's project discovery and the energy markets assessments, there are some signs that we might be heading towards more activist government in this part of the economy. This is something we'll certainly be taking a very close interest in our future work. The key issue seems to be security of supply, which was a major theme of Greg Clark's during the election campaign, and also fair competition, which, depending on what you mean by fair competition, may be more or less alarming or good. The Green Investment Bank, this was one of our really big hits, and I was one of the authors towards the back of the audience of our infrastructure report. It will be really interesting to see the detail of this, because depending on what its mandate is, how it's capitalised, how independent it is from government, it'll be really interesting to see whether this really is a major change in how we do projects, and how it's delivered might actually have a really big impact. And finally, and possibly most esoterically, the floor price of carbon. This has been a constant theme throughout Tory Green papers and in the coalition agreement, but again, the details have yet to be fully made clear, and this is something that's absolutely crucial to get right. It's interesting that the climate change levy was always linked before the election to a carbon floor price, and in the coalition agreement it doesn't seem to be, so there's some concern about how that might be delivered. We have a forthcoming report on that due to publishing fairly soon, which will basically say how we think it should be delivered. Tensions. The really big one is nuclear. This probably doesn't surprise anyone in the room. Although what's really interesting is that I think of all the policy agreements in the coalition deal, this is the one that they effectively prefudged by allowing the Liberal Democrats to abstain. Even more so sort of tuition fees or other really contentious issues where this is the one that they've actually had to do a deal. The Liberal Democrats just had to say, we're going to abstain, but we're not going to stop you pushing it through. Getting the national planning statement through should be relatively simple. Obviously, they also support nuclear power. And it'll be very interesting to see how the left of the Liberal Democrats reacts to it. Again, this links back to Greg Clark's role in getting the planning process for major infrastructure projects right, which is not necessarily very glamorous, but certainly structurally is very important. The energy market assessment. What next on reforms to energy markets? This is potentially really important because every time the government reforms energy markets, unintended consequences tend to emerge. And certainly there seems to be a drift back towards more activist state intervention, certainly around things like capacity payments and those sorts of ideas. So we'll be certainly watching incredibly closely on the ideas that come out of energy markets. The Cave and Walker reviews on water. This is an issue that's been coming up the agenda quite stealthily recently. It's not necessarily another one that's to the forefront of the debate. It's actually really important, and it's a sector that's very overdue for significant reform. Certainly in issues like pricing, competition, extraction of raw water, trading, and those sorts of issues, there's a lot of scope for quite significant reform. Whether the coalition is brave enough to really do it properly, or whether they split, could be important. It's worth noting that the Southwest, which is probably the fiercest electoral battle between the two sides, is also the area where water is the biggest issue, because it's very expensive in the Southwest. Finding savings in DEFRA, this may be a sense of tension, although possibly it's also quite a big opportunity. We've already recommended abolishing Warm Front and the Energy Savings Trust as part of the Green New Deal, which effectively replaces their activities, which is about 10% of DEFRA's budget. So I'm sure there's more to find if you look hard enough. On the DEFRA side, there are plenty of quangoes which there's lots of duplication. The Environment Agency and RAP both seem to do quite a lot of work on waste, and only one of them really needs to do it. And also plenty of quangos which are always raised whenever anyone wants to put this together, the most useless quangos. The British Potato Council may well finally meet its end, although you never know, it seems to surprise them all. There are also plenty of targets that may or may not be missed coming up fairly soon. The 2010 fuel poverty targets will certainly be missed this year. Renewables, this key parts of certainly the previous government's policy and will remain, I suspect, in the new government. And those targets have become increasingly clear that we're struggling to meet our renewable energy targets. How the coalition responds to that, whether they simply say this is a great target or they panic and start creating more policy, is going to be absolutely critical. The introduction of carbon budgets as well will be interesting to see how they react to ongoing progress or the lack thereof there. Finally, on us and our role, certainly on the two policies that we really sort of kicked off that are in the new coalition deal, energy efficiency, it should be relatively simple, but we'll certainly be keeping a close eye on it. The infrastructure bank, our version is an infrastructure bank, the government's version is a green investment bank, which is an interesting distinction. So we'll certainly be giving our opinions on how independent it should be, what its mandate should be, how it should be capitalised. So there's quite a lot of detail there to play for. The detail of the floor price in the emissions trading scheme, this is the carbon tax, basically how to design a carbon tax. And again, there are lots of different proposals going around at the moment. We think we've got a good one, which I'll certainly advertise, watch out in early July. So that this is a really big issue, and while it's quite technical, it's also really, really important. Again, energy and water markets, what they do, we're hoping to shape. This is the source of work that we're hopefully a very good fount of ideas for. And finally, infrastructure delivery and planning. Again, what Greg Clark will be thinking about, what anyone in energy, water, transport, communications, all those sectors is going to have to face up to the planning system. And we're certainly hoping to help shape it. I'll now hand over to my colleague Henry from the Health and Social Care Unit.
Thank you, Robert. So, health and social care. There are lots of nuances in the coalition agreement and the language, but ahead of the general election, I think we all agree there's quite a lot of good agreements on healthcare policy. So, what are the priorities going to be? Certainly achieving efficiency savings of at least 20 billion by 2014. The NHS Chief Executive has been saying for over a year now we need to make efficiency savings of 15 to 20 billion pounds. But Andrew Lansley, in his very first interview as Secretary of State, suggested that more than 20 billion was actually required. Our estimate in the coalition agreement is they're about 7 billion pounds short. So a key question and a priority is where these extra savings are going to come from. Next priority, implementing GP commissioners. At the moment, the NHS is geared for spending, so there's a need to introduce some form of rationing. Primary legislation for GP commissioners, which is going to be the rationing function, is going to waste over a year. So another priority is going to be what aspects of the rationing function of GP commissioners can be implemented with existing legislation. Third priority, improving outcomes without significant additional spending. It's not clear from the coalition agreement what the major levers are going to be, but the hint is in the creation of this economic super-regulator. We believe that choice and competition is going to be the main driver. But the problem with that is it's going to throw up possible tensions for a number of financially challenged NHS trusts. Our fourth priority, pay for performance across the NHS. Annual pay inflation creeps up every year by £420 million. But this is not linked to any improvements in organisational performance. So priority for the coalition should be exploring ideas like a quality and outcomes framework for hospital consultants, linking pay for performance to nurse reviews. Looking at things like this is going to improve NHS productivity. So what do we see the tensions are? Well, primarily it's going to be the NHS against the coalition. There's a coalition promise to protect NHS spending, but the reality is they're going to have to make £20 billion worth of efficiency savings. The public and the NHS are going to see these as cuts. The NHS culture is a very, very powerful force, so they expect the NHS to be one of the main tension and policy tensions areas in the next financial year. Second tension, implementing GP commissions. This is really radical policy. There's going to be a privatisation of the commissioning function of the NHS. That's 80% of NHS spend. So we expect fierce opposition from the BMA, other trade unions, and also the GPs themselves. Up to 40% of GPs don't want to do this. So how do you create this service by getting GP commissioners to take up this rationing function without having a two-tier service? Third tension, parliamentary accountability. There's been a fusion here between the Conservative and Liberal Democrat policies on accountability. Conservative proposal for an independent NHS board has survived, but it's been combined with locally elected PCT members and local authority scrutiny on service closures. but the NHS has to find £20 billion worth of savings. So although it's going to be depoliticised at the national level, locally the NHS is going to be highly politicised. And the fourth tension, cancer drugs fund and NICE, and comparing that to other diseases. So there's been a creation of a 200 million cancer drugs fund, so we've singled out cancer as a special case. But this drugs fund is going to circumvent the value for money process of NICE. So how do we know this £200 million is going to be spent well? And what are the implications for other, less political diseases? Cardiovascular disease, biggest killer, respiratory disease, and mental health. So policy exchange and the new government, how do we fit into all this? Well, public health spending is not going to be ring-fenced. So we expect pricing mechanisms to play a big part in plans for public health. The Coalition's alcohol taxation review was recommended in our note on alcohol, hitting the bottom. We've also listed ideas that you can do on tobacco control in our report, Cough Up. So the key question in tackling obesity will be, how do we encourage food producers and manufacturers to start to create more healthy foods? Incentivising GPs, this is part of the GP commissioning function. How do we get them to move into IOs of deprivation? We need more GPs where the burden is greatest, but incentivising GPs, as we recommended originally in our report, Which Doctor, will need choice and contestability to be driven into the market for primary care, just the same way that choice was driven into the market for secondary care. Transparency in publishing outcome data. So the Department of Health is sitting on, or indeed burying, large amounts of data that could improve patient care. As we recommended in our report many years ago, measure for measure, the NHS needs to focus on publishing outcome data that is meaningful to patients. MRSA rates we've seen today, cancer survival, and success rates for individual surgeons. Long-term diseases. Coalition agreement is entirely silent on this, but health systems around the world are struggling with the burden of long-term diseases. Thousands upon thousands of emergency admissions can be avoided by ensuring that patients simply take their medication. The problem with all this is that the NHS is not set up to motivate this sort of behaviour. We think we need a new business model in healthcare. And finally, integrated healthcare, making hospitals and GPs work better together. There's good evidence that some targets introduced in the last decade cause perverse incentives. So, for example, the unnecessary admissions we see from the 4-hour wait in A&E. But if we could better align community and GP services and acute hospitals, this is going to benefit patients, but also reduce system costs. I'm now going to pass you over to our Director, Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Henry. You've heard a lot now about the different elements of policy. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think the big ideas are of the coalition. But first we're going to start with a little bit of audience participation, and that's a strong poll here. I'm going to ask you how long you think this coalition is going to survive. Very contentious question. So will you put your hands up if you think it's not going to make it to 2 years? It won't see its second birthday. Okay, some skeptical. How many people think it will make it past 2 years? Oh, well, there's a resounding vote of confidence there for the future of the coalition. And I think the majority are right about this. My strong impression from speaking to people at the very centre is that there is a very, very serious attempt to form a coherent agenda for government. A great excitement about that. I see people like Steve Hilton and Paul McKenzie working together very, very closely, almost a kind of mutual Stockholm syndrome is kicking in. Want to identify with each other, they all love each other to death. And so there is an attempt to form a coherent agenda for government. But the problem with this is that we're trying to marry together two things that aren't quite finished. Both the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives haven't themselves quite enunciated what their big idea is. So marrying the two together is very tricky. Let's see what we already know. Okay, so the Conservatives have had a few goes at answering the question about what's the big idea. We had the post-bureaucratic age, a rather unlovely phrase, but a good idea. It's an idea about decentralisation, transparency, accountability. You can see that reflected in policies like school choice, like GP and hospital choice, and police accountability. We also had David Cameron's attempt to mend the broken society. Remember he said, there is no longer a need to mend our broken economy, there is a need to fix our broken society. And they have to do both, of course. But you can see the broken society agenda reflected in things like the marriage tax allowance, welfare reform agenda, and things that IBS is doing. Most recently of all, of course, we have this most contentious idea of the big society. And I think really the big society is a sort of melange of the two preceding ideas, plus a dash of kind of community organisation and all those kind of cool things. There's an irony, I think, in the election that the big society we presented to people is really a sort of an amalgam of various things that they like. You know, Conservative activists are very motivated by police accountability. They like school choice. They like fixing broken society. But when this was wrapped up in this wrapper we call big society, they said, oh no, I don't like the sound of that. So there's a great a degree of misunderstanding about the big society. What the hell is the post-bureaucratic age anyway? There's a whole bunch of strands to it. One is about choice. So we talked about GP choice, school choice. Also potentially using personal budgets more to deliver their choices, to give people choice by putting the cash in their hands, giving them the choice about how to deliver social care, about skills funding, maybe going back to some of those kind of ideas. A big part of it is about data and accountability. You can see Francis Maud is already getting going on all this. Tomorrow we'll be publishing stuff about infection rates in hospitals. On Friday, we're going to publish the COINS database of all public spending. There are apparently 24 million lines in the COINS database. So Andrew, you're working with Ken. There's a whole bunch of other data that we can put out there, and there's an interesting relationship between the publication of all this data and the choice agenda. So if we publish data on MRSA infection rates in hospitals, and we give you a choice of hospitals, then we have a real force for improvement in the NHS. A number of big IT challenges behind this whole agenda, though. A lot of public sector IT is very, very weak, not able to support the kind of things that the government would like to do. Look at the failure of something like NOMS, for example. Look at the fact that the DWP's computer systems forget you if you've claimed welfare before, and now you come walking back in the front door all over again, you don't know who you are. Court system, very, very weak, 1980s stuff. Police IT, very weak. A wider point about the post-bureaucratic age is about moving from targets to incentives. And lots of different examples we could apply that to. It could be that we move from targets for recycling, awful tonnage targets that we've got at the moment that inspire all this kind of useless recycling by local authorities, to a proper payments by results type of system. We could think about the planning law reforms as an example of this, something that Policy Change pioneered. Instead of having this kind of soup-like system where we use Section 106 to kind of barter between local authorities and developers, we can have a proper modern capitalist democracy system where there is a straight fee for developing in different places. We could look at youth justice. Max has already talked a bit about payment by results for rehabilitation. There's also behaviour change type of policies, I think, are part of the post-bureaucratic age. We talked about the famous nudges, of course. You know, give people smart meters, they can see how much electricity they're using, they'll use less. Universities is a very important part of the agenda. I don't think it's actually fair to say to people, we're going to ask you to pay a lot more for your university tuition, but we're not going to tell you, how well our graduates do in terms of their earnings. We're not going to tell you what kind of tuition you get. And I think we do need to make universities publish the data that they're currently squatting on, if we're going to have a proper market in universities. Of course, we could move from gentle kind of nudges, giving people more information, to what we might call shoves. We might give people little financial incentives to do things. That might be about the household waste. It might be building on the Eddington agenda in transport, trying to squeeze more capacity out of our existing transport networks rather than spending lots more money which we no longer have. So that could be about charging for road access, it could be about other kinds of charging. And of course, it's about democratic reforms. And the coalition is going to do a huge amount on this. Local referendums, right recall for MPs, 200 primary elections for MPs, mayors elected, local government potentially having its finance reformed, or its ring-fenced funding consolidated into an old-fashioned block grant. The RDAs may be the act, maybe not now, and the Lords wholly or mainly elected, of course, not to mention the famous referendum on AV. An agenda which I think is a little bit less well developed is this point about fixing broken society. So IDS did his first big speech the other day, set out his main priorities on welfare reform. He talked about improving work incentives. It's very difficult, of course, and you need to find the money to pay for it. Simplification itself is, of course, not simple. The Centre of Social Justice produced an excellent report by Stephen Bryan, who's now SPAD, looking at one way of simplifying the benefit system. We produced a sort of rival report, which is a simpler version of simplification, which would mean that anyone leaving welfare would always be 100 quid a week better off if they got a job. Very simple system. Increasing the retirement age, I think, is almost a no-brainer, very controversial, but has that happen? Welfare to work reform, eminent sensible things being done by the coalition here, bringing forward the point at which we put you into a welfare work scheme, we don't leave you for a whole year, we put you into these schemes for 6 months. Personally, I think there's an opportunity there to save some money in welfare to work services by doing a bit more like the Australians do, by looking at the types of people who are walking in the door of job centre and saying, well, this person looks like he's going to sort himself out, this other person over here is clearly not, so let's not wait for him to rot for 12 months on welfare, getting more and more difficult to employ, let's get him doing welfare to work stuff now. Incapacity benefit, an absolute nightmare issue, I guess, very bravely facing up to the truth that both parties have dumped people into IB over the years, and they're now going to be very difficult to get back into the labour market. Because the famous thing about incapacity benefit is the longer you stay on it, the sicker you really get. And the famous statistic, of course, being that if you've been on it for more than 2 years, even though 90% of them say they want another job, they're more likely to die or retire than ever work again. Sad indictment of 20 years of failed welfare policies, but something I hope we can make some progress on. Family policy, I think, is very up in the air. So I suppose the flagship policy, which has got all the attention, is of course the transferable tax allowance. But it's a very, very small sum of money. I think its advocates would say that it sends a signal it's not actually going to move a huge number of people into getting married. Reforming the couple benefit system, potentially much more powerful, much more focused, because of course it's poor people that don't get married. But the problem is that fixing the couple benefit system, if you did it in its entirety, would cost £18 billion. £18 billion that of course we don't really have. So what's the answer in terms of family policy? Again, it's something I hope we will look at over the coming months. Interesting ideas, I think, by people like Julia Justice Wilson in the United States, looking at the employability of young men, particularly in areas of deprivation, thinking about that as a way of solving the breakdown of families. Other big questions, of course, Ian Douglas-Smith gave this huge long speech, all these different priorities, and I was left at the end of it thinking, the terrible thing is there's all these other things you haven't talked about, sickness benefits, the rise of DLA, huge spending on all those kind of benefits, housing benefit, the real big dwarfing job seekers' allowance, dwarfing all the benefits you've heard of, and the interconnection between social housing and housing benefit, big thing to sort out. The tax credit system, very much a malfunctioning system, income support, some very radical reforms there in the pipeline already, taking down the age at which we expect people to go back into work, having been lone parents. The causes of poverty, I think, are, this is where I thought IDS's feature there is most interesting. So we have done a number of pieces of policy change critiquing the approach to poverty of the last government, which is all about fixing the symptoms. You give people a certain amount of money, you move them above an arbitrary line. In the case of the last government, it was 60% of median equivalent household disposable income after housing costs. That is not my definition of poverty, but we need to reorientate government policy around the idea of fixing the causes of poverty. I guess I rightly identify them as education underachievement, drug problems, debt. But of course, at the moment, the government is saying that the last government's targets are all staying, and I think there is a tension there, and I think at some stage we need to move on from that approach. Okay, so what is going to happen now? Here are some little changes to think about. I think the coalition potentially has a stronger policy position than either party. If you think about the way that at the start of the negotiations, both sides dumped their least popular policies and took up the most. You can almost imagine the saying, "Oh no, don't make us dump that inheritance tax cut. Oh no, don't force us to abandon migration amnesty. That's wonderful on the also." And so I think the coalition, if it ran against either of the two parties, would beat both of them. And some interesting new opportunities are going to open up for policymakers and all of you. For example, we're having a review of government finance, local government finance. You thought that would never happen. If there is ever going to be a reform of terrible, enfeebling system of local government finance we've got at the moment, it's going to have to be a kind of cross-party affair, and there's some opportunities there to think about other issues like drugs, where the coalition actually might have some opportunities that aren't open to a single-party government. Let's think about the politics of the cost of living too. So inflation is going up, and inflation interest rates are going to follow it, so people are going to be feeling pretty poor as well. Then, of course, their bills are going to go up. Policy Change recently produced a report saying that the bill for infrastructure spending in this country over the next 10 years is £500 billion. Now, our current plan, the plan of policymakers, is to dump that onto your bills, onto your train fare, to your water bill, onto your gas bill. And I'm starting to wonder if people can pay. I also think that if the coalition goes ahead with its plans to increase VAT, the politics of the cost of living are going to become an acute political issue, because of course it's going to be, the government are going to be blamed for making everything so expensive. So there's going to be greater price sensitivity among voters and consumers, much greater focus, I think that means, on value for money. If I think about something like environmental policy, which is currently really run as if cost was no object. We have one carbon price that's £4 a tonne, we have another carbon price that's £440 a tonne. we are squandering a huge amount of money, we could reduce emissions by more for a lower cost. And I think the agenda about value for money is going to become very, very important. There's something about the character of coalition government too. People talk about being kind of government by review, and there are 45 different issues listed in the coalition agreement which they will decide or evaluate or review or consider. That's 45 out of 400 different bullet points in the coalition agreement, so they are quite certain about some things. But nonetheless, I think there is something a bit more discursive, a bit slower, but also, I think, right about this kind of approach by a more technocratic approach where you think carefully before you make policies. Coming after a government which tried to give us the national landlords database and the dogs tax and the 10p rate, I think it's actually quite a good idea to think before you make policy. And there's a huge range of issues where there are genuine reviews. Some, of course, of the reviews are just ways of kicking things into long grass. I don't really think anything very significant is going to happen about human rights reform. But look at some of the others: energy markets, takeover law, corporate transparency, Glass-Steagall type arrangements, non-doms, libel law, legal aid, control orders, vetting and borrowing. All these different things are serious reviews. So the coalition really doesn't know what it's going to do, and there's a great opportunity for policy people, all of you, to have a huge impact as a result of that. One last very important thing to think about, we've already touched on it, the little issue of how we save some money. So the other day, the coalition launched its first $6 billion of spending cuts, or efficiency savings, or savings, as I like to call them. Reactions were unpredictable, pure Thatcherism, says label this, pushing us towards the death spiral, says Danny Blanchflower. Let's just think about that in a bit of perspective. This is spending before and after the cuts. Or rather, well, you can't really see the difference. The little tiny red lines there are the reductions, that's of course pure Thatcherism, the death spiral. Let's put things in perspective as well. If we want to stick to Labour's plans to reduce the deficit, we'll just stick to those. We don't think they're enough, but let's stick to them. Just over the next Parliament, not beyond the next Parliament. Here are some uncontroversial ways of doing what we've said we'll do. We could get rid of most of the welfare system, we could freeze all these benefits, scrap things like winter fuel payments, scrap free TV licenses, and then also raise some taxes. That would be pretty controversial. We could cut every single government department's budget by 12%, or as Andrew said, ring fence the NHS and then cut the rest 25%. Or we could do things similar left wing, where we could say, I don't know, why don't we just raise the basic rate of tax by 10 pence in pounds, so that every single poor person in this country is paying super tax. Not really very palatable options, I think you'll probably all agree. But that is the implication of the current spending envelope. So I think the era of tinkering at the margins is over. The era of quite radical big things is here. This government is really kind of marching forward with a gun to its back because it can't afford not to do big radical things in the final analysis. The fiscal problem is that bad. So my final conclusion about all this is this: the era of small thinking is over. Thank all of you for coming today. And we're now going to move over and take some questions and answers. If you can identify who you are and where you're from before we start, and give our roving microphone people a chance to get to you. And also please do say who you would like to answer your question, and we'll make sure that the right person answers. So do we have anyone who wants to start off?
Thank you. Jeremy Thomas, interested spectator, and if I may direct our first question at our first speaker. You mentioned the notion of increasing civilianization of the police force. How far do you believe this would affect cooperation between the British police and the European police forces, which are structured often on a different level, particularly the major ones, given that an increasing amount of serious crime now takes place on a European level, as was pointed out at a policy exchange event last year, I believe, by both Chris Hooner and Cyril Blair?
Good question. I'm not sure that it would have a huge effect. I think we're talking more about moving police officers who are doing very either back office functions or incredibly specialised roles. And we're talking about having staff replace those functions rather than having either hugely overqualified sworn officers doing those things. Or, for instance, things like forensics, where you don't need to have sworn officers doing forensic investigations. You could have simply, that could be a role and a function in itself. You don't need to be start as a constable and go be a police officer for 15 years. So I think those are the kinds of efficiencies we're talking about. I don't think it will have a huge impact on cooperation, either inter-force cooperation in the UK or cooperation between, say, the Net and the KPLD in the Netherlands, for example.
On just a related note, we do think there's a huge amount to learn about police reform from some other European countries, particularly the Netherlands. I mean, they're doing very limited things. They have sort of patrolling, all the officers are IT enabled, they can see on their palm where all the other officers are, so they don't have to go in pairs. They have kind of wacky things like they have paperwork clamped down, they have all these sloping desks, so you can't even have any paperwork going around. It's just slightly off the wall, but very, very interesting things going on in some of the European countries. Is there another question over there?
Hello, Faisal from Channel 4 News. It's probably over you, Neil. I just wondered, one of the big things coming out of Treasury and Department of Business is that Britain will rebalance towards an economy that's sort of more industrialised, more German style, less reliant on finance. Most countries that have achieved that have done it by investing huge amounts and borrowing. Is that plausible, feasible, likely even?
Okay. It's a very good question, something we thought about. Just before the election, we published a big paper on manufacturing, which is our kind of strategic alternative to Peter Mandelson's new industrial activism. There are, I think, very sensible things you can do to help create the right atmosphere for manufacturing. You can reform some elements of tax policy. There are big things you can do in terms of skills, really important things you can do in terms of universities. We've made a bit of a mistake, I think, over the last few years in encouraging universities to become so commercial that they clamp all their IP to themselves, and they're not really very friendly to business for that reason. And we sort of need to remember that these are publicly funded institutions providing information and knowledge as a public good, which is there for a business to just come and exploit. So maybe changing that approach, reversing back a bit from where we've got to. Lots of sensible things we can do on business. I don't believe that you can get anywhere really by just borrowing a lot of money and trying to plough it into manufacturing. Look at the French approach. It's given them a small manufacturing sector than us. So there are a lot of myths, I think, about industrial intervention. I think there are some sensible things you can do. I don't think the idea we just borrow loads of money and sort of the government will become a nationalised investor is a good one. I don't think what Peter Mandelsson was doing made any sense.
Thank you. So Alex Stevenson from Politics.uk. A question for Neil and Andrew. About perceptions of spending cuts or efficiency savings, which we saw a lot of in the general election campaign. I noticed we were talking about the death spiral, and that bar graph didn't look much like a death spiral really at all. But then the prospect of 50% cuts potentially, in other departments, is quite alarming. During the campaign, I noticed this huge difference between the way the £6 billion of cuts was presented. On the one hand, you had it was one penny in every pound. On the other, as Brown put it, 6,000 millions being cut. So perceptions of spending cuts and the need for politicians to present that. How much of an issue do you think that's going to be?
So the kind of spending cuts that we need, suppose that we were to have 80 billion, that's something like 11%. Suppose that we only had even just 40 billion, so it's 5.5% of spending. So the largest cuts delivered in the UK since the Second World War were those of the mid-1970s, which were about 4% of spending in 1 year. That led to a general strike, bodies not being buried in the streets. Germans declared it's no longer a developed economy. So if you're going to have 11% cuts in spending, that's something like 3 years in a row of cuts on that sort of scale. That's going to have some pretty significant impact on public sentiment, you should expect some sort of resistance in terms of strikes and so on, I think inevitably. So it's definitely going to be very painful. We also did some research on past fiscal consolidations both in the UK and around the world, and we found that there were a number of countries in which there are occasions in which people have benefited politically from spending cuts, from getting consolidations right, particularly when there have been failed consolidations in the past. Unfortunately, none of them was British. Basically, in Britain, every time you cut spending money a significant amount, you're out. and you're out for decades. So it's very understandable that politicians in the UK are very nervous about saying that they're going to cut spending by any significant amount, and that they have to at the same time manage to say enough to deliver credibility to financial markets, also say enough to give appropriate signals to other spending departments and to civil servants about what's really required, but to provide some sort of confidence blended with realism for the public.
And you also asked a bit about perceptions. Now we did some polling on this, which is now available on our website. Because the language is everything. So if you ask people whether they would like to cut spending, or if you ask them whether they'd like to control spending, controlling spending is about 80% more popular. If you look at where people are happy to see reductions, don't like the idea of reducing the state pension or the NHS or education, they're mad keen to cut lots of small departments, DCLG, DCMS, they're nothing to public. But the only really large element of spending that the public are happy to see cut is the benefits bill, other than for pensioners. So there's a thought there. Also, one of the things we found in our polling was about the interesting finding that potentially deficit reduction beats either tax cuts or spending rises in a kind of three-way contest. So I think there are opportunities if politicians can get the language right to sell this. I think we're a long way away from where we need to be. When I see quotes from Polly Toynbee about 6 million figure, it's like someone who you know is about to go on a sort of 20-mile SAS march and pack on their backs like, oh, there's a total paper cut. And there's no real, I think one of Brown's toxic legacies really to the country is to leave us with a sense, because he kept saying there would be no cuts, a complete lack of reality in the public discussion. People know there will be cuts, but they have no idea how the problem is.
Just one other quick point on this is that, of course, if you think spending cuts on this scale are going to be unpopular, imagine the consequences of raising taxes by £100 billion. And think of what that's going to imply in terms of 25p on the basic rate of income tax or something of that sort. So that I think would be pretty unpopular as well.
Thank you. Tom Galton from Accenture. Just building on that last conversation and recalling that I think you'd said that you were going to be advocating cuts in the region of 120 billion over the course of the next Parliament, or suggesting.
So just to clarify, so what we've said is that we think that it'd be nice to get rid of about 100 of the 120 billion structural deficit, and so that should be take something like 80 billion of spending cuts, 20 billion of tax rises, and those of course are the headline figures. I mean, because of where we are in the cycle, that means that the actual number coming off spending is more like 65 billion.
Okay. Even so, the point that interests me here is that yes, language is almost everything. I think wallets are probably, at the end of the day, they're the real test, and most members of the public probably don't appreciate the implication on their wallet until the £5 note isn't there anymore. Given the challenges that there are going to be and the reaction that is going to happen from the public, given the scale of the cuts that are required, do you really think that this coalition government can survive? And which do you think is the most important thing for them at the moment, the survival of a coalition or to address the public deficit?
Well, it's a very, very good question. Of course, famously in the coalition agreement, it says the central priority is deficit reduction. I find it very difficult to know how Labour are going to play this, because of course this is one of the issues that's going to play in their leadership election. Is it really credible for a moderate Labour leader to say that if we were in government, none of these cuts would be happening, we're against all these cuts? I think there is a real chance that if they went down that route, they would just become very marginal to the debate and not look serious. I think there is some understanding of the problem. Of course, being in government gives great opportunity to the coalition to move public opinion. You could see some of the things that are happening about the publication of high salaries and things like that as being part of that kind of process. So I think that they can make a lot of progress on deficit. I think it will be easy, it will test the coalition certainly, but there is something about being in government that gives you a chance to win some of these intellectual and kind of cultural arguments. I hope that answers your question. There's a question just in front of you.
Roger here in BBC. Another question for your economist, moving from the obviously very unpopular to perhaps more popular measures, banking reform. You alluded to various things, including separation of retail investment and Glass-Steagall, also remuneration. What appetite do you think there actually is for for doing something serious on that, and also obviously paying into the international coordination of that, which is rather crucial, at least as far as many bankers are concerned.
Okay, so I think that there's a sense that, so the right sense should be that Britain has been a global leader in terms of the financial sector, and so they should think that if we get it right, then other people are going to follow. I think that's the right view to take. I don't think that high degrees of international coordination are helpful, particularly in this. In fact, it seems to me that the high degree of international coordination of financial regulation in the run-up to the crisis was a factor in the highly internationalized nature of the crisis itself. So the next thing that I would say is on the remuneration point. I think that there might be a little bit of a hope that by having some reviews and putting things off a little bit later, that public anger might have diminished. And so although you can make some noises for now, whether you really need to do anything over the longer term might be a little bit open to question. I do think that you're more likely to... Another thing about that is that what you need to do on the remuneration side will depend very much on how far you get in other respects. So if you find credible mechanisms by which bondholders lose money so that you have better incentives delivered by market forces in the financial sector, then you need to do less in the way of regulation restricting things like remuneration. So because there's an interrelationship between different kinds of regulation here, I think that that makes it useful actually to put off your final decision on things like remuneration to a little bit later. On the side of the retail and investment banking separation, my candid view is that the Conservatives don't believe that that's really a runner. I am suspicious about how much the Liberal Democrats actually believe that it's a runner. I think, though, that they do think that something's got to change here, right? So we can't go on as we've gone before. So that might not be a runner, but if we're not going to do that, then somebody better come up with something better. We think we've come up with something better, which might be next week's next week's presentation rather than this one. But I think that people are definitely in the market for ideas of things to do here. People talk about living wills and other kinds of schemes as well. So I think that there is absolutely a need. You can't fail to find significant changes to financial regulation. There's a need and an appetite to do it. Whether the current kind of things on the table are really what will ultimately happen, I think is much more open to question.
Okay, so a couple more questions of Lee there, and then we'll go back.
Diana Spencer, the University World News. I'm interested in the role of the private sector in higher education. Do you think there's going to be an increase in that?
Thank you. Good question. Yeah, I think there is. We're actually doing a piece of work on this at the moment. We're looking at the role of the private sector in higher education in two senses. The first, when it comes to degree awarding powers, currently there are only a handful of private organisations which have degree awarding powers in the UK, and there are a number of quite straightforward obstacles which we think could be removed, which could alleviate that and make it much easier to have private organisations having degrees and also having the title of university status. Currently it's the case that if a private organisation has to get its degree awarding powers reviewed every 6 years, for example, which we think is something that needs to be reformed and looked at. The second aspect as well with respect to the private sector is the role the private sector plays in outsourcing in universities and in higher education space in general. This is something which is further ahead, and there are already a number of players in there, but we're looking at ways of trying to again remove the obstacles that are in place and make that easier, looking at things, for example, like accommodation, estate management, utilisation on university campuses. I think it's only something about 25% at any one time. So the estate is not the university estates are not very efficient, and that's something that we think the private sector would definitely have a role to play in that.
There's a gentleman white shirt in the middle of the background.
Thanks. I'm Ben Coleman from the Family Fund, and I'm also Governor of a School for Severely Disabled Children. To bring it from the macro to the micro, can I just, specifically on disabled children, I was struck during the education presentation, James, that There's nothing about children, and there's nothing that this government is saying about children's services. It's all about education. And from the perspective of disabled children, we'd be very worried if it was all from the perspective of special educational needs. I mean, I'm interested in what you say about academies, but that's only one part of what disabled children need. And can I ask you to take that on board in the work you do? And also perhaps comment on why it is that the Department for Education hasn't yet identified what its 4 ministers are actually going to be doing. And of course, I would like them to say who the disabled children's minister is among those.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a fair point. With respect to disabled children in general, we'd acknowledge that, and having had a roundtable last week on special educational needs, we do appreciate that that space is much more than just the education. It's much more than just the school. It involves working with the council and local authorities to provide many other services. So I have to say that we at the moment are slightly sceptical of the idea of just being able to apply Academy's agenda onto that. Certainly is something which I will take on board, the sense that disabled children education there's much more to disabled children and looking after disabled children and education. On the point of the ministers inside the department, well, that's something which I need to follow up. I'm not sure if there will actually be a minister for disabled children as such. I think that it's certainly something which will fall underneath the portfolio of one of the ministers that are at the moment. I know that Tim Lawton has taken a specific interest in that area and social care in general, so perhaps it's something which he would follow up on and take on board.
Good. Time for just a couple more questions, and one towards the front here.
To the health researcher, David Birch from the UK Consulting. When Andrew Lansley, before the election, Andrew Lansley said he wanted to rename his title to be Secretary of State for Public Health. We've seen nothing on that yet. But as you said, the public health section of the budget isn't ring-fenced. The last Labour government spent a lot of money on marketing campaigns trying to change sinful behaviour. Do you think he will approach it differently in terms of the mix of price and non-price measures, particularly given the need to obviate the long-term costs of the bad behaviours and the obvious attraction of raising some money by penalising them?
I think the short-term realities of actually having to deliver the sort of change that the health service needs, we're going to end up with a situation we did in 2005 where public health spending conveniently gets wrapped into paying salaries. And so that's why I think pricing mechanisms are going to be fundamentally the way forward. Very, very short and sweet answer. I think all the public health spending money is just going to get eaten up. So public advertising campaigns, there'll be few, they are effective in terms of driving activity, driving people towards the activities that you want in terms of helping quit smoking and perhaps increasing activity. But the reality is people will see adverts on TV and say, why are these going on?
So maybe green in this row.
It's quite Andrew, Deborah Hyde at City Y. You mentioned double dip a couple of times. I was wondering how likely you think that is and how much of a risk that is to your hopes for significant spending cuts.
I think it's really quite likely. So what do I mean by double dip? What I mean by that is one or more quarters over the next year where there's a contraction of less than 0.5% of GDP. So I mean kind of something akin in our recession to the slight dip back that there was in the early 90s recession after an initial period of recovery. A more, perhaps a bigger challenge to the spending cuts program might be if there were to be a takeoff in inflation over the medium term, by which I mean, say, the next couple of years, it's quite plausible that that would be associated with quite considerable rises in interest rates, which then might induce another recession somewhere out in the 2013, 2014 region. I believe that the 2010s will look much more like the 1970s in being periods in which there were fairly aggressive periods of growth. I expect 2011 to be a big boom year, which have to be managed down because they were then associated with big rises in inflation, so they have to be managed down by periodic recessions as well. So
and I actually think that that risk is one important reason why we need to get our spending cuts going early. Because if we didn't get spending cuts going at quite high levels quite early, then when you did get that sort of recession a little bit down the line, I think there would be risk of gilts market, serious gilts market concerns and threats of failed auctions and so on for the UK. So that's I think the key thing there.
Good. I think we've got time only for just one last question, which is related just. Sorry, I was going to listen to say that just thank you. You've been very patient.
Thank you. Can I ask two completely unrelated quick questions? The first is you've made no mention of the independent school sector. Sorry, I'm Sue Stapley from Quiller Consultants. Bearing in mind that most of the new administration benefited from the best education that money can buy, are they going to continue the tax relief and charitable status, or not spend any time on that, just working on the retained sector? And secondly, do you think there's any chance of a reform of the legislation for right to die provisions?
Sorry, it's the second question.
First issue, I guess.
First is the on the independent school sector. Yes, you're quite right. There hasn't been much discussion of that at the moment. On the charitable, I'm not sure what state they're going to take on the charitable status. The focus certainly is on the maintained sector, as that is clearly the area which needs most improvement and which applies to most children and young people across the country. So that's certainly the focus at the moment. Nate, do you want to?
Fred, I can't answer your question about right to die. I'm not aware of any views on that front. We've run out of time for the formal session. All of our panelists are going to be hanging around afterwards if you want to ask your remaining questions. I'm sorry, I didn't manage to take all of them outside, so please do join us for a drink and continue the conversation. But just remains for me to thank all of our brilliant panelists and thank all of you for coming today. Cheers.